Brothers and sisters, we live in a time where silence is betrayal, where truth is censored and the system rewards the blind, punishes the brave, and fears the man who dares to speak. They built this system like a fortress, with walls of lies, a foundation of injustice, and a ceiling meant to crush the heads of those who dared to rise. But understand this, no fortress stands forever, and when truth becomes a weapon in the mouth of the oppressed, that fortress begins to tremble. You don't need bombs to bring down empires. You don't need bullets to fight corruption. The most powerful weapon is truth, unapologetic, unfiltered, and unchained. They fear truth more than they fear violence. Because a gun can kill a man, but truth can awaken a people. And once a people are awake, no power on earth can put them back to sleep. Now they told us to wait. Wait for justice. Wait for freedom. Wait for dignity. But I say, how long must the wounded wait for healing? How long must the starved wait for bread? How long must the chained wait for freedom? The system thrives on delay. It feeds on our patience. It prays we never speak. But I tell you today, speak. Speak with fire. Speak with purpose. Speak like your life depends on it, because it does. They want you to think your words don't matter, that your voice is weak. But why do they work so hard to silence you if your voice has no power? See, when truth walks into the room, lies scatter like roaches under a light. When a man stands tall and speaks what they've tried to bury, the ground beneath them begins to shake. They built schools to miseducate. They built prisons to isolate. They built media to manipulate. And they built politics to pacify. But they could never build a muzzle strong enough to silence the truth. Because truth, once spoken, is contagious. Truth is the most powerful weapon against oppression because it does not require permission, power, or privilege to exist. It lives within the hearts of the people, buried beneath centuries of silence, waiting for the right voice to speak it aloud. It does not ask for validation from authority, and it doesn't tremble before thrones or titles. While regimes have built empires on lies, deception, and brute force, the truth has quietly sharpened its edges in the minds of the oppressed, biding its time, ready to cut through the fabric of illusion at the right moment. Oppression thrives where truth is hidden, distorted, or silenced, but the moment it is spoken plainly, it becomes a force no law, army, or institution can contain. It strikes not just at the surface of injustice, but at its roots. It exposes what was concealed, brings to light what was buried, and disrupts the systems that depend on ignorance to survive. The truth is not polite. It does not wear a suit and ask to speak. It demands to be heard, and it has no patience for comfort or compromise. That's why the oppressor fears it, because while they can jail a man, they cannot jail an idea once it is spoken. They can shut down a protest, but they cannot shut down the awakening that begins in a person's soul when they hear the truth that resonates with their pain. They can try to discredit the speaker, but they can't erase the fire that spreads once the match has been lit. The truth challenges everything they've built, not with violence, but with clarity. Not with armies, but with conviction. And the system, no matter how heavily guarded, is always vulnerable to that one voice that dares to call a lie what it is. They fear that voice because it makes others look up. It makes others question. And questioning is dangerous in a world that depends on obedience. The oppressed are told their suffering is normal, their condition is deserved, their future is fixed. But the truth says otherwise. The truth says they are not broken, the system is. It says they were not born inferior, they were taught to believe so. It reminds the oppressed that they are not alone and that their pain is not unique. It is systemic. And once they see that, they stop blaming themselves and start confronting the real enemy. That shift is revolutionary. That awakening is what turns victims into fighters, silence into resistance, and despair into defiance. Oppression cannot exist without lies. It feeds off false narratives. It tells the laborer he is lucky to be exploited. It tells the mother her children's poverty is her fault. It tells the young man he is criminal before he even acts. It invents categories, hierarchies, and rules designed to confuse and control. But truth doesn't play those games. It doesn't dress itself up for the elite. It walks straight to the root and names the thing. It strips away excuses, unmasks the polite faces of power, and says what most are too afraid to admit. That's why the system invests billions in distractions, distortions, and silence. Because they know that once the truth is out, the people will no longer bow. They will rise, and they won't be asking for permission. Truth also unites. Lies divide. The oppressed are kept in conflict. Black versus white, poor versus poorer, religion against religion, while the real enemy sits at the top, counting their profits. But truth cuts through the noise. It reveals that the pain is shared, that the struggle is common, and that liberation for one is liberation for all. That realization is dangerous to the oppressor. It builds solidarity. It builds movements. It makes people realize that their enemy is not the neighbor who looks different, but the structure that profits from both their suffering. That unity, built on truth, cannot be bought or manipulated. It cannot be easily dismantled because it is not rooted in fear or favor, it is rooted in justice. The truth also liberates the mind. A person who knows the truth cannot be ruled by lies. And that is the first step toward freedom, because no one can enslave a mind that refuses to believe its own chains are natural. No one can dominate a person who knows they are more than what the system says they are. That's why truth is the most dangerous weapon of all, not because it hurts bodies, but because it wakes souls. It breaks mental shackles, it shatters illusions, it makes the oppressed see not only who their enemies are, but who they themselves truly are. That kind of realization changes everything. The system can handle protests, they can handle noise, they can even handle violence, because they can predict it, prepare for it, suppress it. But they cannot handle the unfiltered, uncensored truth being spoken from the mouths of the people. They cannot handle a people who refuse to believe in the legitimacy of the very structure built to hold them down. They cannot contain a fire that spreads without fuel, a fire that spreads through words, through thought, through clarity. That fire does not need permission. It does not ask for platforms or airtime. It jumps from voice to voice, heart to heart, until it becomes unstoppable. Truth, once awakened, does not go back to sleep. It keeps burning, it keeps moving, and it keeps pushing until the lies fall apart under their own weight. This is why the system fears education. Not the education in books, but the education in truth. Not the education in memorization, but the education in awareness. The kind of awareness that teaches a man to question, a woman to resist, a child to dream beyond the limits set for them. That kind of truth reshapes the world. That kind of truth destroys the system without lifting a single weapon. Because once the mind is free, the body will follow. Once the lie is broken, the system cannot stand. Once the truth is heard, there is no going back. The system fears voices that refuse to be silenced, because those voices become echoes that reach far beyond the walls of any courtroom, prison, or boardroom. When a man speaks with conviction, when a woman speaks without fear, and when the people speak with clarity and unity, that sound shakes the pillars of every structure built to contain them. The system depends on silence. It is not built on strength, but on submission. It survives not because it is just or righteous, but because it convinces people to stay quiet, to stay small, to stay in line. A single voice that dares to rise above that silence becomes a ripple that grows into a wave, and waves are not easily stopped. The louder that voice becomes, the more the system trembles. It is not the noise that frightens them. It is the truth behind the noise, the determination in the tone, and the refusal to be controlled that makes the system panic. The system has always been designed to manage speech. From the earliest days of power, it has written rules about who gets to speak and who must remain silent. It labels the truth teller as a threat, the rebel as a criminal, the questioner as an enemy. It creates laws not to protect justice, but to protect the illusion of order, an order that serves the powerful and punishes the bold. But the moment a voice breaks that illusion and says what is not supposed to be said, the system loses control of the narrative. That is its greatest fear, losing control of the story it has told for generations. Because stories are power, narratives shape perception. And once the people start to hear a different story, one that is raw, unfiltered, and spoken by someone who refuses to bow, the old lies begin to unravel. This is why censorship exists. This is why whistleblowers are hunted. This is why dissidents are watched. The system knows that a man with a gun can be killed, but a man with a message that resonates with millions cannot be silenced so easily. A silenced man may be buried, but his words become seeds. The louder the voice, the more seeds are scattered, and eventually truth begins to grow in places the system cannot reach. They can shut down microphones, close platforms, ban books, even erase faces from history. But they cannot erase the memory of courage. They cannot unhear the words that woke the soul of the people. Voices that refuse to be silenced inspire others to speak. That is the wildfire effect the system cannot contain. One voice speaks out, and suddenly another follows. Then another, and soon a chorus of resistance forms, not because it was planned, but because it was sparked. The courage of one voice becomes the courage of many. And the system knows that once the people begin to speak with their own tongues, not the tongues of their oppressors, it will lose its grip. That is why fear is used as a tool. Fear of punishment, fear of rejection, fear of exile. Because fear keeps voices locked in the throat. But when someone breaks that lock, the most powerful revolutions in history were born not from violence, but from voices. Voices that refuse to accept the rules of silence. Voices that expose corruption, injustice, hypocrisy. Voices that turned whispers into roars. The system is not afraid of violence. It is built to survive violence. But it is not built to survive mass awakening. It is not built to withstand people who think for themselves, question everything, and speak without apology. That is why the system always moves first to silence. It always tries to control language, limit speech, dictate what can and cannot be said, because words carry power, because speech carries energy, and because truth once spoken freely cannot be unspoken. Every time someone speaks truth to power, they break the spell the system casts over the people. That spell, that illusion. depends on silence, on politeness, on fear. But one voice that cuts through, that can undo the whole enchantment. And that is why such voices are demonized. They are painted as troublemakers, as radicals, as threats to peace. But it is not peace the system protects, it is obedience. It is not harmony they defend, it is hierarchy. And any voice that challenges that hierarchy is seen as dangerous, even if it speaks with calm and reason, because it threatens the fragile balance that allows the few to rule the many. The system will always tolerate noise that changes nothing. It will even promote voices that shout but say little, voices that distract rather than disturb. But the voice it fears most is the one that speaks truth clearly, persistently, and fearlessly. The one that keeps speaking even when no one claps, even when everyone walks away, even when threats come from all directions. That voice is rare. But when it rises, it reminds the people of their own voice. And that memory is revolutionary. Voices that refuse to be silenced are reminders that power is not absolute. They are proof that authority can be challenged. They are echoes of every rebel, prophet, and freedom fighter who stood before the people and said what others were too afraid to say. They are living resistance. And resistance, once vocalized, spreads faster than fear. The system can control institutions, it can control money, it can control weapons. But it cannot control a mind once it is free. And the voice is the first proof of that freedom. It is the signal that the spell is broken, that the veil has been lifted, that the people are no longer asleep. That voice may start alone. It may be mocked, attacked, isolated. But if it endures, if it refuses to be silenced, it becomes more than a voice. It becomes a movement. It becomes a mirror. It becomes a storm. And the system, no matter how strong it seems, cannot survive a storm of truth spoken by people who will not go back into silence. The system fears that voice not because of what it says in the moment, but because of what it starts. Because it starts a fire that burns through illusions. Because it starts a rhythm that others begin to follow. Because it starts a change that cannot be undone. Words can awaken the people more effectively than violence because words reach places that weapons never can. A bullet may silence a man, but a word can awaken a generation. A sword may force a body to kneel, but a sentence can lift a soul from centuries of submission. Violence speaks in blood and fear, but words speak in fire and memory. Words seep into the cracks of a broken system and plant ideas that do not die. They echo through history, they burn in the conscience, they light up minds in the darkest of places. A weapon can destroy a life, but a word, spoken with truth, conviction, and purpose, can rebuild it. Words are not just sounds. They are seeds, they are sparks, they are storms. And when the oppressed find their voice, the sound of truth can be more terrifying to the system than any uprising. People don't rise when they're simply hurt. They rise when they understand why they've been hurt. They rise when they give language to their pain. They rise when someone dares to say what everyone else has felt but feared to speak. Words take confusion and shape it into clarity. They take isolation and turn it into connection. They take silent suffering and mold it into collective resistance. One voice speaking truth loudly and without shame can wake people from generations of slumber. That voice becomes a mirror, reflecting the lies they were taught and the power they forgot they had. That voice becomes a map, pointing to the real enemy, not the distractions placed before them. That voice becomes a drumbeat, calling others to awaken and stand. The system relies on confusion. It depends on miseducation, on fear, on distraction. It survives by keeping people angry but unfocused, loud but directionless. But words, when shaped by truth and courage, provide direction. They shine a light through the fog and give people the language to name their chains. Once people can name their oppression, they begin to fight it. Once they understand its design, they begin to dismantle it. And once they realize it was never natural, that it was never just fate or bad luck, but a deliberate system designed to profit off their pain, they begin to awaken. That awakening is more powerful than any riot, more permanent than any rebellion, because it does not end with a moment, it becomes a movement. Words awaken not by entertaining, but by unsettling. They strike chords that were buried deep beneath layers of propaganda and survival. They force people to confront truths they try to ignore. They agitate, they disrupt, they provoke thought where only numbness existed. And in that disturbance there is power, because people do not change when they are comfortable. They change when they are moved, when they are shaken, when they are disturbed by a truth they can no longer deny. That is what words can do. They can make someone sit up in the middle of the night, thinking differently, seeing differently, breathing differently. That shift does not come from fear. It comes from understanding. Violence can force people to move, but it cannot teach them why they should. It can intimidate, but it cannot inspire. It can shake buildings, but it cannot build minds. Words can. Words have. Every great movement that changed the world began not with violence, but with vision. And vision is carried through language. It is spoken first before it is marched. It is imagined through speech before it is realized in action. The most dangerous weapon to those in power is not the stone or the flame. It is the voice that speaks against the lie, that questions the narrative, that exposes what was never meant to be seen. History remembers those who spoke before the world was ready to listen. Those who challenged the silence, who refused the script, who stood up and said what needed to be said even when the world wasn't ready to hear it. Their words lived on long after their bodies were gone. Their words continued to awaken, continued to rise in the minds of the forgotten, continued to sharpen the vision of those still chained. Because once a powerful truth has been spoken, it does not die, it repeats. It evolves, it spreads, and eventually it reaches someone ready to act. Words create unity. They bring together the scattered. They remind people that their suffering is not unique, that their anger is not irrational, that their dreams are not impossible. Through speech, people see themselves in others. Through dialogue, they realize they are not alone. Through shared truth, they realize they are a force. That realization, that connection, that unity, it does not come from war, it comes from words. The system fears that unity because it cannot be easily broken. When people stand together, speaking one truth with many tongues, the system begins to crack, because it cannot divide what has already been bonded by truth. There is a reason the first move of every tyrant is to silence speech. There is a reason books are burned, voices are censored, histories are erased, because even the most violent regimes understand that words carry the power to undo them. Even the most powerful empires tremble at the thought of the people finding their voice, because they know what comes next. They know that once words begin to awaken the people, the fear begins to shift. No longer are the people afraid of the system. Now the system is afraid of the people. And what awakens people is not poetry for the elite or speeches wrapped in pleasantries. It is raw truth. It is fearless truth. It is someone standing with no armor, no agenda, no permission. Just fire in the belly and truth in the mouth. That kind of speech cuts through centuries. It doesn't ask for applause. It doesn't wait for approval. It speaks because it must. It speaks because silence has become betrayal. It speaks because the people are asleep, and someone must call them back to life. Violence can be justified or condemned, but words cannot be ignored. They stay, they haunt, they linger in classrooms, echo in prisons, drift into households, rise on protest signs. They remind the people of who they are, what they deserve, and what they must no longer accept. That reminder is the first step toward freedom. Because once the people wake up, they start asking questions. They start demanding answers. They start refusing to settle for survival. They start fighting not just to breathe, but to live with dignity, purpose, and justice. Speaking truth with courage cracks the foundations of injustice, because the very power of an unjust system lies in the fear it instills. Fear is the cement that holds up the walls of oppression. It is the silence that fills the courtroom before a verdict, the pause in a classroom before a student dares to ask, why? The hesitation in a worker's voice before they speak against exploitation. But when someone speaks the truth without fear, when that fear is replaced with courage, something begins to shift. The silence is broken, the lie is named, and the illusion of invincibility begins to crumble, because injustice relies on the appearance of permanence. It needs the people to believe that the way things are is the way things have to be. But the moment someone speaks truth with clarity and refuses to back down, that illusion is pierced. And once the illusion breaks, the structure weakens. It takes courage to speak truth in a world built on lies. It takes more than facts. It takes more than intellect. It takes a willingness to stand alone, to be hated, to be targeted. That is why truth tellers are not always welcomed while they live. They are called dangerous, divisive, reckless. But the system uses those words to protect itself. It fears what the truth will reveal, because truth exposes contradictions. It reveals the gap between what a nation says it stands for and what it actually does. It uncovers the suffering that has been normalized, the corruption that has been sanitized, the exploitation that has been disguised as order. And the people who speak this truth with courage become a threat not because they break laws, but because they break spells. The power of courage is that it gives others permission to be brave. When someone sees another stand up, unshaken and unafraid, they begin to ask why they've been sitting down for so long. They begin to realize that the fear that held them back was never truly theirs, it was given to them, passed down through systems of punishment, shame, and silence. But courage interrupts that inheritance. Courage stands tall and speaks clearly even when the cost is high. And that act becomes a mirror for everyone watching. It forces them to look at themselves and decide whether they will remain in fear or join in truth. Injustice is built to withstand resistance, but it is not built to withstand honesty spoken boldly and repeatedly. That kind of truth spreads like wildfire. It cannot be bribed, it cannot be co-opted, and it cannot be domesticated. It does not try to be palatable or polite. It does not concern itself with comfort. It is a blade that cuts deep, but it also heals. Because healing does not come from pretending things are fine. It comes from confronting what is broken. And the voice of the courageous truth teller does exactly that. It doesn't whisper. It declares. It points to the wound and demands it be seen. demands it be acknowledged, demands it be treated. The reason the system fears this is because it knows that once the people begin to speak this way, once truth is no longer whispered in the dark but shouted in the light, the system will no longer be able to control the narrative. It will no longer be able to disguise injustice as policy or mass cruelty as tradition. The language of courage strips away the euphemisms and gets to the root. It says the quiet part out loud. It says what everyone knows but no one dares admit. And that kind of speech has always been the beginning of every revolution, every uprising, every transformation. Not because it called for blood, but because it called for honesty. Courageous truth shakes the foundations because it cannot be predicted. It does not ask for strategy. It does not wait for the perfect moment. It speaks when it must. And that spontaneity frightens those in power. They cannot anticipate it. They cannot suppress it before it spreads. And when the truth begins to ripple out from a single voice to hundreds, to thousands, to millions, the foundation that once seemed immovable begins to tremble. Because it was never built on justice. It was built on obedience. And obedience cannot survive in the presence of truth spoken boldly. The history of every movement against injustice begins with speech. The march comes later. The protest comes after. The court case, the boycott, the revolution. All of it begins with someone speaking when they were told to be silent. Someone standing when they were told to kneel. Someone naming what was wrong when everyone else had accepted it as normal. And that voice, that defiance, becomes a crack in the wall. Not a collapse, not yet, but a fracture. And from that fracture, light gets in. From that fracture, others begin to see. And what begins as one crack becomes 2, then 10, then a network of breaking points across the entire structure. Because when one person speaks with courage, others follow. The fear that once protected the system becomes the fear that surrounds it. Power without justice is fragile. It may look solid, but it is hollow. And truth, when spoken fearlessly, rings against that hollowness like a bell. It exposes the emptiness behind the titles, the laws, the traditions. It reminds the people that power is not the same as righteousness. That authority is not the same as truth. And when the people remember that, they begin to stop obeying. They begin to stop apologizing. They begin to stop accepting less than they deserve. That change does not come from weapons. It comes from words. It comes from those who speak, not to please, but to awaken. The system expects people to be afraid. It counts on fear. It expects truth to be tamed, truth to be polite, truth to be hidden. But when truth is spoken with courage, it becomes fire. It spreads. It ignites what was numb. It revives what was dead. And it cannot be undone. The powerful may try to discredit it, imprison it, or even kill the one who spoke it. But the damage to injustice is already done. Because once the truth is out, and the people are no longer afraid to speak it, the foundation begins to give way. Not with a sudden explosion, but with a slow and unstoppable collapse. The weight of all the lies, the fear, the cruelty, it begins to fold in on itself. And all it took to start was one voice that refused to remain silent.